Just double checking, Sue. Is it on yet? Oh, there we go.
There it is. Yep.
Well, welcome everybody to the Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council meeting on April 2nd. We've got several folks on, and I expect that Catherine will join us in a few minutes once the team starts cooperating for her. So I'm just going to go through and do a roll call here, make sure that we've got a quorum. So do I see Secretary Curley on the line? Or anybody representing Secretary Curley? Okay. And Chad Farrell, I see he is on. And I see Joe Segali is on. See, it's a lot easier to do a roll call when it's not a conference call. I see Ann Lawless is on. And is Karen Horn on? Okay, and Mike Burke is on. Is David? Hello. Is David Snedeker on?
He's in the waiting room.
Oh, I see him. There. David. Okay, and then we have several staff support folks that are on from VEM and public service, I see. Okay, just one more second for any ACCD representatives. We have more than a quorum, so we should be all set. Okie dokie. Well, we can get rolling with it. So next we can move into our review and approval of the agenda and the 319 minutes. The only change to the agenda that I'm going to propose is that we move member announcements and updates to right after this topic, rather than saving it to the end, so that we don't miss out on anything pertinent when we're into our work. Does anybody have any objections to that? Okay, and we could just move that topic to up to the final line for subsequent meetings. And then we've got the minutes from 319 are linked into the agenda, so if you want to take a look at those, and we can give that a minute. We'll need a motion to approve or not, or any discussion for that's needed for changes.
I'll move to approve them.
Okay, Joe Segali.
Yeah, I reviewed them. I didn't see anything in there that was.
Okay, and Mike Burke seconds. All in favor to approve, or any discussion? Okay, all in favor to approve the minutes from 319.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No oppositions. Great. Okay, so we agreed to move member announcements and updates up to the front of the line. So we're going to go over that right now. I have a couple of updates. One, I really appreciate everybody being very flexible last week. I apologize that we missed the deadline for getting the agenda developed. Just the days got away from us, and so we wanted to make sure that we were complying with the spirit and word of the public records law. So we did extend this meeting to an hour and a half, so that especially because we're going to plan on working on the work plan for the majority of it, and that'll give us a bit more time. And we may have some meetings, I think, moving forward, that just depending on the work that needs to be done, where we may have to extend it or not. So we'll be sure to give you plenty of notice if we need to extend it or otherwise.
It actually worked out pretty well because we did have some climate change weather in the form of a tornado and downburst winds. So that was helpful from my perspective because we were pretty busy. So thank you.
Yeah, it turned out I had no time for for another meeting this last week either. And then we had another situation in Bolton as well, so that we were trying to provide some support on. So so that was yes, it did work out. So, Catherine, I wanted to open it up to you. I don't know if you made it on. I see you on the list, but
Yes, I did. Finally,
Hello.
Microsoft Teams finally agreed to let me join the meeting.
Hi,
Hello.
how are you?
Thanks for getting us started.
No problem. We're on member announcements and updates, and maybe I thought the next topic we could just give a synopsis of the Climate Council meeting that was between our last subcommittee meeting and this meeting. It was a pretty informative meeting. A lot of discussion around the subcommittee charges, and something that did certainly come up was the overlap and intertwining of a number of areas that are charged to the subcommittees. Like, for example, resilience in general. We realized that there was sorry about that. The beagle dog. The one area in resilience that intertwines that we really needed to clarify was that the agriculture and ecosystems subcommittee also has a really important part of overall resilience, especially as it relates to ecological resilience and how that impacts kind of the downstream areas. And so we had a meeting after the Climate Council meeting with Abby Corse and Billy Coster and Jane Lazorchak to clarify that. And so what we agreed upon is really the scope of resilience for resilience and adaptation will really be specific to built environment. And those aspects of resilience that a municipality can control. It's still not as cut and dry as one would hope, because there's still going to be some intertwining. But we think that as we move forward with our work plans, and especially as we come to the point where we need to do some drafting on the climate action plan, we'll have some really close and intertwined work with agriculture and ecosystems, because of the interdependencies of the systems that they'll be talking about the resilience of on ours. Catherine, I don't know if there was anything else that you wanted to update from the Climate Council meeting itself, or that discussion.
Right. So from the Climate Council itself, the important thing I think we talked about that is useful for everyone else to know is that we recognized at the state level that there'll be the opportunity for a great deal of data sharing between the Comprehensive Energy Plan update and this Climate Action Plan. So rather than duplicating much of the data collection and analysis, we'll be able to intertwine the two and rely significantly on the work that's being done and already planned for the Comprehensive Energy Plan. So I think that's good news for our work. And I think it'll be helpful for the public too, to try to see how the two work together. And then I also see that Jane has her hand up and perhaps wanted to add something.
Thank you. Afternoon, everybody. I did just want to share in following up on Erica's conversation about the overlap in subcommittee charges that you all should have that final document now that lays out the subcommittee charges for all 5 committees and does our best at identifying leads with respect to some of the broad topic areas that will be covered by the subcommittees at the front of that. And that was shared along with the agenda that went to the steering committee of the Vermont Climate Council this week. And I shared it also with all council members and all subcommittee members. And that document was approved as is by the steering committee yesterday. So sort of that agreement that Erica spoke to, that we all came to between the co-chairs of the 2 subcommittees in particular, was highlighted and reinforced and approved by the steering committee. So I'll just support that. And then also along the lines with what Catherine just mentioned around our technical analyses, as I alluded to in an email to all of you, I shared with you where we're at with the RFP for the technical analyses. And while much of the work in the current scope of services that we're going out for recruitment on doesn't pertain to the work of this subcommittee, I think there could be discrete tasks that this subcommittee might want to consider for contracting or granting out to other organizations to help you accomplish your work. And I just wanted to reinforce that that ship hasn't sailed, that we're trying to get this big RFP out the door, but then there'll be opportunity for you all to consider what support you still might need to advance the work of this subcommittee, and hopefully we'll still have funding, I expect, to consider some more smaller, discrete contracts to support the work.
Thanks, Jane. That's great that the steering committee they generally support the outline that you shared. Is that outline clarification going to be shared with, the entirety of the subcommittees as well at some point?
Yeah, so that the subcommittee charges were finalized in that email, and now they're on the website because they're there for the supporting documentation of the subcommittees. So that is up in there, but so you should all have it or have access to it on the website if you don't, but I have a number of email updates for subcommittees to send later today, and I should reinforce for everybody that those are approved as is and that we're good to go.
Awesome. So any other member updates or updates from the group that you'd like to share, or just questions about what we've already talked about? Alrighty, so we can move into subcommittee membership. And I'd like to welcome Kate McCarthy from the Natural Resources Council joining us today. As you know, at the last meeting, we decided that we'd love to have to ask her if she would join us as a member, as well as Shane Jaquith. And Kate is giving us a trial run here. She's seeing what we're all about. And Kate, would you like to just talk a little bit about your work, and as well as anything else that you'd like to share with us?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here. It's nice to be picked. And I know many of you, but not all of you, and I appreciate this group for what it's going to do. So I've been at VNRC for about 9.5 years. I direct our Sustainable Communities program, which is a land use-based program, and we focus a lot on smart growth, preventing sprawl, and keeping farm and forest land intact. So those pieces play very nicely into the elements of resilience that we need to advance as a state, whether it's keeping our downtowns and villages from flooding, keeping our upland forests intact so they can attenuate floodwaters, keeping our farmland intact so that we can have resilience in our food system, and on and on. I have worked on resilience in a few different ways, Tropical Storm Irene being one of them, and then some of the follow-up state work and the Resilient Vermont Network with the Institute for Sustainable Communities. So I've done a lot of work on that, and have since been somewhat involved in that group that's now part of the Norwich University Center for Global Resilience and Security, or Center for Security and Global Resilience. So I come with those experiences and that curiosity. I'm glad we're focusing on those small incremental actions in the right direction, because it's easy to make small incremental actions that undermine the resources that keep us resilient. And I also worked for a very brief stint at a regional planning commission, and my degree is in regional planning. So I hope that we are also able to talk about and identify some regional initiatives that boost resilience too, since so much happens at the watershed level. So I'll be doing a lot of listening today, I hope, but I appreciate being here with all of you.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
So we also had some follow-up with Shane Jaquith, and just because of the organizational commitment to time that, and now I'm forgetting, I don't know why I'm blanking on the name of where he works. Help me out here.
The Nature Conservancy.
Thank you. I was having a hard time there. So the Nation Conservancy also has Lauren Oates, who is obviously very much involved on the agriculture and ecosystem side, as well as she's a steering committee member. So we're not prohibited from consulting with Shane, and probably we will, but he wasn't able to commit to membership at this time, which is totally understanding. The other, yeah, there you go. I'm gonna hand it over to you, Kathy.
Sure. I think Erica and I would like to recommend to you the addition of one more subcommittee member. And this member was brought to us upon the recommendation of Abby Course, who's the co-chair of the Agriculture and Natural Systems. Is that, whether I got that name right, I don't know. And she actually, I think, would be a really great member. I'm pulling up the information about her. She is currently environmental organizer for Relief, and she used to work for Vital Communities, and she is the assistant town clerk for the town of Hartford. So she checks a number of boxes, both from an environmental perspective, a geographical perspective, a municipal viewpoint perspective, and I think would be a really great addition to our team if she's willing.
And I think it could be, we didn't ask her to join today because we wanted to present it to the committee, but with your blessing, we would like to reach out to her and see if she'd have interest in joining the committee. There's also that will allow us to have kind of a diversity of viewpoints as well. Because of the geographic diversity, as well as her work. Relief is an organization to amplify the voices of BIPOC community members, and as it relates to, and I have the website up right now. If you go to Relief, and that's RELEAF collective.org, they are to grow and support a network of BIPOC Vermonters passionate about land, environment, agriculture, space, which I think would be just a great addition in perspective to this committee. So any discussion about that or thoughts about that? It is outside of our normal process that we followed thus far, but I think we, as we refine our membership and as we refine the voices that we want to ensure are on the committee, I think it does take a bit more targeted outreach, so I think that's where we are right now.
Erica, I'll just add that I do think she was actually, just so you know, she was nominated through the formal process. I think I bucketed her somehow, how I did a lot of the bucketing of putting people for the right subcommittee, I thought. And I think I don't remember the details exactly, but I'm pretty confident that I must have recommended her for Ag and Ecosystems. And as Abby knew her and talked with her, it became clear that she resided better for this subcommittee.
She sounds like she'd be a great addition to me, so.
I agree.
Okay. Are there any concerns about us reaching out and offering to have her come on as a member here? Just throwing that out there that way. Okay, awesome. So we'll reach out to her, and I am sure she will be joining us. And it does sound like this time of day on Fridays works for her, so that's great. Wonderful. Okay, any other items on membership? Alrighty. Hey, we have work plan work to do. So, hey, Catherine, since I have to shift over to another meeting at 2. Do you want to pull up the work plan, or would you like me to just I don't know how best it works I can facilitate the language if you want to type, and then as we shift over, you can do both. I think the latest version is the version 2 that you had sent out to the subcommittee after our last meeting.
Yeah, sure. Just give me a minute to find it and share it. If you want to introduce what we're hoping to do today, while I do that.
Okay, so we do need to, as we said the last meeting, our work plan is really the central driver of the tasks of the subcommittee, and we did we did talk a bit more about what the work plan contained and how we are approaching it at the Climate Council meeting, the bigger meeting. Now we really need to dive into this, make sure that our language that's in the work plan is, is clear enough, the intent is clear, the outcomes are clear, and start assigning some roles and responsibilities as well as timelines. And so that's what we're really going to focus on today. Are there any comments or suggestions related to this before we dive right in? So looking at objective 1, this is related to our review of existing initiatives and planning and programs around mitigation or climate change adaptation. I'm not very articulate this afternoon. I don't know why. And so the full cycle of strategies here we'll need to identify roles and responsibilities for this in general. And we've already started talking about the fact that there's already an inventory that's in existence that we can use and build upon. Mm-hmm. So so let's, Catherine, do you think we should just start by going down through strategy A, B, and C, or do we want to take the objective as a whole and maybe identify a lead members or members, and then we can, be more specific within the strategies themselves?
I think that sounds fine too. I'm now looking at this and wondering if I've put up the most recent version, so give me a moment to look again.
Okay. Did you email that around? I don't recall. I can't find it as I'm looking, but it would have come from you, Catherine.
It would have come from Catherine.
Yeah, and it looks like it was the 18th where the last edits were made on it, unless that was sent right before the meeting, at least the one I have.
Yeah, I don't think we edited it anymore after the 18th.
Okay, then this is right.
Right.
Then this is it. Okay.
It's whatever one that you send, and if it should say version 2 on it.
This one's dated 3/19/21, so this has got to be the most recent then.
Yeah, and then our Climate Council meeting was on the 22nd, so we didn't make any moves after that.
Okay, great. So we're good.
Cool. So let's. This is really. This is going to require some good, robust discussion around these strategies and whether we need to, refine them or add to them, or and we will need to, for example, strategy A. Identifying necessary public and stakeholder engagement related to this objective. That may be a whole committee activity that needs to happen, and then as a whole committee, and then we would assign some of the more in-depth work to members or others. Jane?
I just thought I'd make a comment broadly about public engagement, so you guys were all aware. The contract for engagement and outreach has sort of stalled in negotiation, I'll just say, but really hopeful that we'll agree to the scope of services and the payment provisions today, actually, and then hopefully have an executed contract next week. For all of you know, we have this RFP that went out. We had 5 proposals. We're awarding the contract to Climate Access, who specializes in this kind of work, and they've also assembled a team to bring in the diversity, inclusion, equity kind of components, as well as expertise around website design, so we can launch a website for the work. And I'll just say that one of the areas that we considered when thinking about sort of subcommittee lead overlap kind of issues was engagement, recognizing that all of the subcommittees have an engagement, a public engagement component and sort of requirement to their work. But we've been thinking about Just Transitions subcommittee taking the lead on sort of spearheading what that will look like, both with like initial outreach to help formulate recommendations and strategies, as well as working with subcommittees to test the ideas and strategies and thoughts that you're coming up with. So that meeting will be like sort of kicked off with the Just Transitions Committee meeting next Thursday, where Just Transitions is meeting with the consultant and the facilitator to start to frame that and think about tools to provide the other subcommittees with around engagement. So I just wanted to put a plug in that hopefully you'll be supported, really supported and brought along with Just Transitions, as well as the contractor, to think about how you test this work with the public and how you get input from the public early on for this.
Great. Mike Burke.
Yeah, I was also thinking about, as we say, right, in Objective 1, review existing planning program strategies. So there is a ton of programs that are already up and running and getting out of the gate. Like I think about the RDOF grants for communication and broadband resiliency, and just to get it out there. Obviously, there's many private companies like Green Mountain Power that are already well into their resiliency programs. And I just am thinking about how those types of things would roll into this. I'm hoping that they become supportive of those initiatives that are already underway, which maybe can help kick those into even higher gear than they are right now. But I know there's some development that we have to do to get recommendations out, but I also wonder if there's opportunity to help be supportive of programs that are already out there.
I think this is my 2 cents. I think those are exactly the type of programs that are referenced here, that are meant to be referenced here. This part of the exercise is supposed to be an inventory, and then result in recommendations from the subcommittee around the utilization of those and or the revision of some of them. Joe?
Yeah, I just want to second that. I think the first step is identifying those to start with, and then there's some analysis, and so B is sort of completing that inventory, and I think the gap analysis and whatever one D or E is kind of how do we bring those two things together. Maybe it's not just a gap analysis, maybe it's a overlap analysis too, and like where are the opportunities, based on what we see. I also just wanted to ask about the public, outreach, because I think you have that in every one of these objectives, is to try to think about, within this objective, what's the right thing to do for public outreach, and in this one, there's a lot of gathering of information, and, I'm just trying to think about practically how do you do that, how does the public, I understand stakeholders, right, because there's stakeholders that have programs, and we may want to try to, our strategy here is trying to reach out to those stakeholders and make sure we're collecting the information for the inventory. And we probably have enough people that are participating, on the committee, on this on the subcommittee as well as the other staff people that are here, that we could reach out to enough people and kind of address the stakeholder question. But as far as the general public goes, is this the right place to get information from them?
Well, Joe, Jane also put in the comments that maybe it's really stakeholder engagement that we're talking about here. I mean, the Global Warming Solutions Act has a kind of an umbrella requirement that there is engagement with the public as well as, you know, stakeholder engagement. And I think we could think hard about, like, is this one where we really want to identify stakeholders that we should be engaging with to make sure that we come up with an all-inclusive inventory, and really the public engagement maybe happens later, and maybe it's more of a public presentation of the results. So I mean, we could identify right here, and the action is identifying necessary public and stakeholder engagement. Maybe we just have a conversation as a subcommittee, as a part of another meeting here, where we say, okay, what is our public and stakeholder engagement related to each of these objectives, so that we can clarify that. And maybe that's the action here, is that that's a subcommittee responsibility, that we identify public and stakeholder engagement needs for each of our work plan objectives, and then we can outline that a little bit more effectively. What do you think about that, Catherine?
I think that makes sense, and we may determine for any of these objectives that public or stakeholder engagement is not necessary, or it may only be necessary for one of the strategies. And I think having the opportunity to define what that looks like in the context of the overall planning process makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
I think when you actually get programs and you are about to get them up and running in building resiliency and things like that, I do think public engagement in the form of maybe going to those communities and say, hey, this is what we're recommending, or this is what we're physically doing, is incredibly helpful. I've been doing a little bit of that myself, and it really brings the community along and gets the community excited. So I do think maybe it's more of an implementation after you've landed where you want to go.
So I think where we've landed is that for these strategies that are identify necessary public and stakeholder engagement, we will spend some time as a committee and think through each one of those, whether they need it and what it looks like. So that, and I think that's going to color a lot of the subsequent actions that have to happen, because there could be a couple of these where we need to do that public engagement before we embark on the work. Or it could be an after the fact, more of an informative process. I told you I wasn't very articulate today. Okay. Any more discussion on those, on the strategy A's of our objectives? And we'll make sure to get that into do we want to identify a timeline to talk more in depth about that? Jane, when do we need to, is there a time frame where we need to look at or define the public and stakeholder engagement needs from a contractor support perspective?
Yeah, currently within the statute and the timeline, it articulates two components of outreach in June and again in October with the draft plan. I think there are a lot of moving targets, I'll say, about like when we'll have data analysis done, and then so like important moments to go out and communicate that with the public. And again, the statute really only talks about like going out to the public with recommendations and getting input on preliminary ideas. But I think to have a truly just and equitable plan, we're recognizing that public engagement needs to be early and often, and the public needs to be working with us on development of strategies and recommendations. So I think after next week, we'll have a better understanding of what we might be able to achieve. And then I'll also state that at the steering committee meeting this week, and I think at the bulk of the next climate council meeting will be sort of coming to consensus around an outline for the climate action plan that's due in December 1st, so that we know the end goal that we're all working towards, and then I can be more intentional with the facilitators and starting to provide you all sort of templates to be starting to think about how you'll work into a climate action plan. That includes your work with the public. It also includes templates for what a recommendation would look like, what a strategy would look like, your inventory. And so that's all this. It's sort of like, as I've said, like building the train while we're barreling down the tracks. But hopefully that's all will be coming to you in a timely manner, and especially thinking about what public engagement will look like from the onset all the way through the end date. We'll certainly start to have a better idea of that as the consultant comes on and meets with Just Transitions next week.
So why don't we put a timeline for better defining this in completing the identification part of public and stakeholder engagement for each of our objectives for the end of the month in April. What do you think about that? That way we can have a good idea of what we need.
The other thing I just thought while I was talking about the outline for the plan that I maybe this will be a space holder for next week's meeting with you all that I would welcome help on is, it wasn't that hard for me to think about a draft outline for the climate action plan for the greenhouse gas emission targets. I'm struggling still, and my next draft is going to try to do a better job of like figuring out how does the sequestration work and resiliency work sort of fold into what the climate action plan looks like, because there's clear statutory requirements for greenhouse gas emission reductions and what has to be in this first plan. What you have to do for resiliency work is not quite as sort of guided by strict timeline, and is more of an open-ended question in my mind. And some states, their plans are all encompassing and mesh strategies with for sequestration with greenhouse gas emission reductions. In California, though, for say, they have 3 separate plans, one for greenhouse gas reductions, one for resiliency, and one for sequestration. And so I don't think that's where we want to go, but how to do it clearly in thinking about how the work will fold in. It would be great if I bring that to you all next week, the outline, to have a conversation about it ahead of the council meeting then.
Hey, Stephanie and Marion, would that be something that you would be willing to lend your planning expertise on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
And I was just going to say, in terms of joint plans, the state of Massachusetts has a joint state hazard mitigation plan and climate action plan. And I think that the climate action piece is really much more focused on what Jane was talking about, that emissions component, with the state hazard mitigation plan more focused on that resiliency piece.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm happy to help. Stephanie and I can chat offline about what that looks like.
Thank you to both of you. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, our state emergency management plan has a kind of a base plan, or what is the umbrella plan that identifies what the framework is. And then our, for each of the, I can't remember what their names are now, it's been so long.
Mission area plans.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have 5 mission areas, and we have separate plans that kind of roll up into that. And so that, that could be a potential format that you want to use. But there's lots of different options. Great, and I'd love to see it too. Okay, so as we move into strategy B, and these are more outcome oriented, reviewing and updating inventory of adaptation resilience activities for the Global Warming Solutions Act spreadsheet. to include any additional state programs and adding local and regional plans and programs. There's already a really good inventory that's in play here that we should really build upon. And I thought that we could assign that to Joe Segali and Stephanie Smith, since Joe offered it up to begin with. No good deed goes unpunished.
Sure.
I think that's. Go ahead, Joe.
I think just, to Mike's point earlier, to the list of whatever else we probably have done a pretty good job already of capturing the state and local programs and regional programs. And, I think maybe some help on what, the non-governmental programs that are out there, private sector or whatever other organizations might be working on this stuff. So I don't know if there's anybody who could help with that specifically, but that would be helpful.
I could certainly round up the distribution utility energy sector as well as the communications sector too. I'm actually working with Corey Chase and the DPS to identify a lot of that as well. So
that would be great. And so is a goal that we would, or like the to do would be, we would maybe kind of get together quickly as a little work group here, and then get to work on this.
Okay.
Right. Joe, it's been a minute since I looked at that inventory. Is that organized, or can it be organized to reflect the categories that we have above, which is the local and regional land use planning, transportation planning, energy planning, operations planning?
Yeah, it could be organized to do that. I don't think without too much effort. It's been, I haven't looked at it. It's been more than a minute since I've looked at it. So I remember it had something in there on sectors, and yeah, sure we could, if that's important to identify the planning categories that it might relate to, we could do that.
This is Ben. I'll just comment that this development of an inventory of what's going on outside of government is one of those places where you do want to do some outreach. And I think that vehicles for that outreach include the other working groups, possibly Tara's resilience group at Norwich, and the flood resilience listserv. And like Stephanie, we could put something out on the flood resilience listserv asking people. Also, Mindy Brink might have something to offer that would go on that list.
Right. So it might be worth creating like an input survey. Is that what you're
Yes.
suggesting, Ben? Yeah.
Yes. And those are some vehicles for getting it out.
And when it comes to the regional and local land use planning pieces, I'll certainly volunteer myself, and I'll volunteer Kate as well to provide any input if you need some of that filled out. Okay, Kate?
Dive right in.
Should we just clarify the language on strategy B to conduct outreach to inventory programs that to make sure that the inventory is all inclusive? Something along that lines. Okay. So it sounds like we've got some folks that can help on that. Joe and Stephanie, I'm going to leave you as the leads on that. You folks can work to update the inventory and then work to conduct any outreach. I think we've just identified an outreach or stakeholder engagement item that's needed. So there you go.
Okay.
Okay, any other details that we should outline for strategy B? Okay, we'll move on to C, identify threats and hazards that impact overall resilience as a baseline and rank in terms of severity, time frame, and other factors. So, so VEM has done this in a few different forms. So I'm going to propose, having us be the lead for this piece. And I'll have to consult my team here on the best way to embark on that.
I have a comment on that. There were specific threats identified, or consequences or threats, whatever you want to call them, that were identified in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And some of those may or may not be in the list that's in the State Hazard Mitigation Plan. Mm-hmm. And then there might be other threats that aren't on either list that maybe, need to be included. And one of them that just comes to my mind is somebody, this has come up often, and somebody mentioned it at one of the Climate Council meetings, just having to do with, climate migration, and whether or not, and this is probably a longer term sort of threat maybe, but, might there be more people moving to Vermont because of climate change? And I don't think that's it.
Is that a threat?
Or pandemics.
Yeah, Joe, it's Ben. We definitely had some of that discussion in the State Hazard Mitigation Plan working groups. And there is some discussion in the State Hazard Mitigation Plan about the potential impact on Vermont's environment of things that happen elsewhere. There's also an acknowledgement that we don't get into a lot of depth in this cycle of the State Hazard Mitigation Plan on what we call the creeping hazards, the things like invasive species encroachment, because they're not the closest alligators, but we know they're happening and need to be looked at on the long-term horizon. But the State Hazard Mitigation Plan is definitely a good place to start.
Yes, absolutely.
So and I think I was just trying to think about how this ties into the overall outcomes here. And I'm just gonna describe this, and folks tell me if I'm wrong or tell me if I need to revise. But I see VEM being able to produce kind of a central document that could be utilized as the as essential guidance that is the threats and hazards that are posed statewide by climate change. And that's how we would define any policy recommendations, is in reference to those hazards and threats. Is that what the intended outcome we think is?
I saw it at, I think, yes, but maybe I'm going to say the same thing, but I saw it as, given all these existing programs that we have, and you sort of overlay the threats on that, and then just think about, is there something that we're missing, or is there something that we're not doing enough of, or could be doing better, given the threats that we have to deal with. Those two things, B and C really go together.
Okay. Okay,
Does
good.
that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I was just trying to make sure that what we come up with is meeting the needs of this work and is really drawn upon, when we do all, many of the other tasks, like making recommendations for programs or initiatives that should be taken. So if we know what the threats and hazards are, we know what programs exist, then we can do a little bit of a gap analysis to understand where we need to be focusing efforts of programs or policy to address. Okay.
Joe's comment on the migration, I hadn't even thought about the effects of pandemic migration, or how communities, in an extreme pandemic, not that this isn't one, how do communities take care of each other, even right down to the health and maybe that's in another subcommittee, but it did make me think of how broad are we? Do we worry about that, or is there another committee worrying about that?
I think I want to make sure I understand your question, Mike. Are we talking about the community resilience piece itself, like individual and community resilience, and the networks that support that?
It just made me think of, you know, migration, more people, hospitals are overwhelmed. Do communities have a certain resiliency to be able to take care of something like that themselves? That's what I was thinking out loud on.
I saw Kate McCarthy, you put your hand up for a second and then took it down.
Oh, sure. I wanted to give Mike some space. Thank you. I think identifying, under strategy C, identifying climate migration as perhaps a factor more than a threat or a hazard would be good. I think that the threat or hazard that could stem from that is depends on where people who come to Vermont decide to live. Do they live in floodplains? That would be more of a hazard than if they didn't. Do they build a new house in a forested area that was previously providing a resilience value? That would be a resilience issue. So I don't think there's data yet on who's moving, where they're moving to, what types of distribution onto the landscape we're seeing. But this plan is one place that could be noted as a background factor. It might be for the next update of this climate action plan, but it's something I'm personally, professionally interested in because I think it will, like so much growth in Vermont, it's kind of slow and incremental, which makes it all the more important to pay attention to it.
I like how you have characterized climate migration, that it's not necessarily a threat, that it's more of a factor that we have to take into account when we're talking about the resilience to other threats and hazards.
Before we move off of this objective, I just want to make sure we don't lose this piece, which is we're not just looking at resilience, but we're looking at how these programs that focus on resilience can be used to enhance greenhouse gas emission reductions. So I just want to make sure we don't lose that part of our charge in this conversation.
I think that's where D comes in, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And so we don't have anybody assigned to that yet, and maybe that's where we need some consultant assistance. I don't know.
Well, I wonder if there's, as a part of the inventorying process, for those programs that are inventoried, or as a part of the outreach process for, inventorying programs, we could ask or identify whether there's a specific objective of that program or policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because some of them are explicitly for that purpose. And then some of them, it might not be as clear, but that could be a part of the inventory, and that would give us a leg up on that piece.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Joe and Stephanie, you're okay with that?
Yeah, I mean, we can take a stab at it. Some things are obvious, some things maybe not so obvious.
Yeah.
So if there's a question mark, just say question mark.
Okay, so we'll include that in the inventorying process, in the analysis of that. The other one is identifying and prioritizing program or policy gaps, as well as program or policy modifications, and I see that as a natural progression of the strategies that are above. So we will at some point need to as a committee, kind of come together, understand what the inventory says, probably have Joe and Stephanie present to us, have VEM talk about the outcome of the threats and hazards and that analyses, and then from there, discuss and prioritize what gaps there are, and then what recommendations we would make as a committee to fulfill those gaps. Go ahead, Ben.
Sorry to keep hearkening back to the existing state hazard mitigation plan. It might just be post-traumatic stress, but there is a very nice and potentially helpful chart in there where we looked at the recommended actions and identified which ones require legislative or policy action. So there's actually a list of things in the hazard mitigation plan that are above our pay grade, which would be a good place to start.
I remember that format. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say before I have to go, the Global Warming Solutions Act makes it clear that we should not just be starting everything from scratch either, that we should be utilizing existing documents like the State Hazard Mitigation Plan, because there's a lot of work that has gone into that. So anyway. I'm gonna hop off, and sorry we couldn't get a little bit further, but Catherine will do a great job leading you from here, and we will talk again next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Erica.
Thank you.
So while I'm sharing my screen, I'm having Teams challenges and actually seeing anybody besides my screen. So I don't know if anybody else would like to volunteer to facilitate while I type. Otherwise, I would just ask that you speak up because I can't see you to call on you. Unless somebody can tell me the quick way of fixing that.
If you have to type, it's not easy actually, but if you aren't actually typing, you can just click on the little one person talking down there and it'll bring everything back up.
Yes, I see, but then I can't type. Okay.
Then you can't type, so it doesn't help that much.
Okay.
I'll tell you who's got their hand up, Catherine.
All right.
Karen Horn has her hand up.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you. I wasn't sure if it actually went up or not. I've never used it on Teams before. But I'm just wondering, looking at these strategies, we don't talk about opportunities at all. And the one that comes to mind just offhand is remote work in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But is there a place where we're going to focus on opportunities?
Great question.
Well, I mean, I think that could be done in E, right?
Does that do it, Karen, to just remind ourselves?
I'm sure. I'm on a phone, so
okay.
I can't see what you're typing, but
So,
I've got the document up on my computer. So
on strategy E, it would now read identify and prioritize program or policy gaps, comma, opportunities for new programs and policies and program or policy modifications.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, thank you for reminding us to think differently too.
Catherine, this is Dave Snedeker.
Hi, Dave.
Hi, wouldn't that come up under best practice recommendations potentially? Which is objective 2?
I think it can go in both. So I think that's a good reminder to make sure we do that under, you mean objective 2?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good reminder to make sure we incorporate that into objective 2 as well. And if that is okay with everybody else, based on Dave's suggestion, moving us to objective 2, I'm going to go ahead and move us there. If that's all right. Okay. So objective 2 is this best practice recommendation specific to rural communities. So this one was a challenging one because we will need to rely on some other groups and committees for some of this information, but also do some of our own work as well. So strategy A, we have already decided all of those will be up to the subcommittee to work on collectively at a future time. Strategy B is to evaluate the availability of the fossil fuel consumption data and recommendations as necessary to obtain it. How do folks think about how we're going to do that and how it might relate to some of the other committee work like the data committee?
And Margolis has her hand up.
Hey there. I think I've mentioned just before at our last meeting, but I think this has been formally worked into the work plan for the Science and Data Subcommittee. So my suggestion would be to either look to the work they're doing or at least coordinate with them if we're doing our own separate work.
I'm perfectly happy looking to the work of the Science and Data Committee unless someone on our committee feels a strong need to try to take the lead on a piece of this.
So what do you mean by look to it? You mean incorporate it, just use it?
Yeah, that would be my suggestion, is they're actively pursuing this data or the recommendations for the means to obtain it. And I think we can just borrow from their work or incorporate their work in its, entirety. I think they're seeking the same outcome that we are seeking here.
How does that work for everybody, that will rely on the work of the Science and Data Committee and provide comment and feedback as they do their work?
Kate, did you have a question about this?
A quick comment that Catherine has probably already thought of, but it seems like if this data exists already, it would be perhaps in any enhanced energy plans at the municipal or regional level. So that makes me feel even better about handing it off to the Science and Data.
I wish it existed.
Yeah, it's a tough granular level. I certainly understand. Yeah,
it is. All right, so moving on to strategy C then, which is to develop the baseline critical infrastructure definition. I'm wondering if, like the strategy above, we could rely on VEM to provide a draft based on the critical infrastructure definition.
This is Mary, and I can certainly touch base with Erica. I think we have folks that are looking at critical infrastructure and even going further into working with other partners across the state on a sort of critical infrastructure index. So hopefully that could be incorporated in here, but I can touch base with Erica about that.
Great, thank you. How do folks feel about that, since there is that work ongoing at the state level through VEM with partners, to simply rely on that work as our baseline?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Great. I like how everybody's happy to rely on others to do this and not wanting to reinvent it. That's good.
You don't want to duplicate.
That's right. So what about strategy D, evaluating challenges to rural energy resilience and recommendations for system needs and gaps? And I'm going to turn to you, Mike, as giving us some initial feedback about this one.
I think we started to talk about this last time, where there's community resilience and then there's individual resilience at the home, right? So we have both. So storage would be a part of this at the unit level, while a lot of the programs that GMP and others are doing, where we are trying to build storm hardened lines into certain communities based on the threat level they have, would take care of a lot of the bigger town-wide resilience. So evaluate challenges to. I mean, the challenges are just the rural communities are farther away from everything, including energy hubs. So yeah, let me think on this one a little more.
Is this anything the comprehensive energy plan might be addressing?
I think we're going to talk about resilience, but it's not necessarily a statutory focus of the plan. So I don't, there's a nexus, I guess. There's a synergy between the CEP and the climate action plan, as we've kind of been talking about throughout. It's kind of who takes the lead here. I think, there's a project that Mike referenced GMP's doing to identify the resilience, energy and telecommunications and social vulnerability sort of indices across their service territory. And we're trying to go for some FEMA funding at the state through VEM to do that in the other areas of the state. But I guess I'm just not clear. Is this just inventorying, this evaluation, in which case, or is it really identifying very specifically here are the areas? So I think how specific we want to get there can determine, the time frame and how these inputs I've been mentioning are going to play into it. But are you trying to figure out who's going to take the lead here, or what's the purpose of what we're trying to figure out right now?
A little bit of both. If there are people who can take the lead, and then further discussion about what we're actually thinking we're doing under these strategies.
Yeah, the word challenges is what's throwing me off a little bit. Evaluate rural energy resilience is almost easier than the challenges. But yeah, maybe Ann and I can take this and work on it.
Sounds good to me.
Thank you both for doing that. I don't really know yet what the time frame is that makes sense on that, but we can leave that. We haven't really talked about that for most of these, so we can kind of leave that a question for now. But I appreciate both of you being willing to take the lead on that. And then also under this, we have the best practice recommendations for critical infrastructure. And again, I think it's related to, scroll back up to the actual objective, fortifying critical transportation, electricity, and community infrastructure.
It almost seems like that's informed a bit by the policy gap analysis above as well. I know it's focused on critical infrastructure, but this particular question, but.
I think that's a great point. Dave, do you see this as a place where the new ideas as well should be incorporated?
I guess it could be, yeah.
Any other thoughts on that one?
It might be a lengthy list.
It surely might be. And will there, for some of the critical infrastructure, and do you think that there will be some recommendations in the comprehensive energy plan related to the electric system?
Yes.
Okay.
For sure. I mean, there's this we're definitely going to be talking about, at what point does reliability become resilience, and how does, how do those two terms interplay? What means what? How does reliability, how is it impacted by, the increased threats from climate change, and at what point do you tip over into this resilience world? Some of it's terminology. A lot of the things I think people think of as resilience, we're already kind of talking about in the reliability sphere. So we will be talking about that for sure in the context of the grid, and to some extent connectivity as it relates to, the needs of the grid and our energy system going forward.
It also makes me think, for those of us that were on Resilient Vermont soon after Irene, there were a lot of recommendations that came out from that group. I think of for transportation specifically. And again, I wonder if we can look at anything that we did there to not redo everything that might have already been done. I do remember as part of that group that there were recommendations that came out on culvert size. That's work that's already been done. And I assume transportation is part of this critical infrastructure as well. So we should look back at that group and see what they came up with.
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
On that point, it's been, that's true, Mike. I was on that Resilient Vermont group as well, and we took all the recommendations from their final report and rolled them into a big list in the State Hazard Mitigation Plan. I think we identified 130 some odd recommendations that had been compiled in one report or working group or another following Irene, and we made that list an attachment in the State Hazard Mitigation Plan. So again, it's a good place to start.
Yeah.
Great. So it sounds like for this one, we have a lot of ongoing work again that we'll be able to rely on in terms of our inventory to start a list of best practice recommendations, and then maybe build on that, incorporate any new things that we might want to suggest.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is going to be kind of a group effort on that one.
Mm-hmm.
I think we probably all from the different sectors we may represent be able to kind of, generate that list of what we're doing, what we think we need. Again, informed from the work that's going to be done previously.
Right. Great. And then the strategy F, we have refining the cross-sector mitigation recommendations on greenhouse gas emissions for rural communities. So I think that one is one where we will be waiting for them to begin their work or wait for them to do their work, depending upon how they want us to participate in that part of the conversation. And Jane, I don't know if you have any insight on how this strategy might relate to their work.
They haven't really talked about, they've talked about cross-pollination with science and data, and then of course with ag and ecosystems, who will be thinking about ag emission reductions and feeding into cross-sector. But we haven't talked about this one in particular, and I'm happy to help facilitate flagging that for them.
Okay, great. So I'll just make a note of that. Anne, I see you just showed up on my screen. Were you going to jump in? I don't know if it's just cycling through people. I can only see one person at a time. So then we have for strategy G is to refine the recommendations of the findings and provide avenues. It seems like similar to some of these other strategies, that's really a full committee task that we could do at one of our committee meetings. other ideas for that?
That's another one though that I'll just highlight for them because there's like this like timeline component of like how that work happens. So.
Okay, great. Any other?
And some of that is already underway, depending on, again, how you look at the resilience. So, you know, whole town resilience, there's private companies working on that already. Individual resilience. Probably too, but I can tell you that we're fully engaged in trying to make rural communities more resilient with their electrical infrastructure.
So I'll make it that same note here that versus individual level will need to be addressed. All right, we've got a few more minutes, so I'm going to see how far we can get through objective 3 before we wrap up our meeting and move on to public comment. So objective number 3, before I move on, were there any other thoughts about objective 2? Okay, so objective 3, this is where we're developing a municipal vulnerability index to identify communities that may be most adversely affected. So the first task we have here is to research the available climate change vulnerability index methods. And what are folks' thoughts about that?
Well, I have one initial thought would be, this would be a great one to hand off to a consultant. I think it's kind of, it's pretty technical and it's pretty focused. So yeah, I mean, it could feed in, Jane, if, could feed into the scope of work that you might be developing for the second consultant, which I think is going to be providing other assistance, right?
Yes, this has been one that I keep flagging because I don't know if you guys saw my comment in the chat, but I kind of feel like we've been struggling with sort of like what goes in this first climate action plan and what is sort of like mentioned as strategies and ideas that still need further refinement for a future plan. I kind of feel like that around the resiliency work too, like you have a lot here. What will be sort of for the first plan and what will need more refinement? And what I've heard you guys say early on though, is this municipal vulnerability index is a big task. I don't know a lot about them myself, indices, these kinds of indices. And yes, I think this has been one that I keep holding up as a likelihood that we would contract out. And maybe we should just have a conversation around what that would look like at another meeting, specifically this objective, and how the needs could be met through a consultant, because it seems like a discrete task for sure, and we should talk about it. And the reason I sort of went into that background on what's required of this plan and what's not is this is actually listed in the statute as something this committee is supposed to produce for this plan. And so thinking about, is that possible? Does that mean we're on our way? What does it mean really to have this for the first plan, and can we have it by December 1st?
It's like Dave Snedeker and then Mike had a comment.
Thanks, Joe. My question is on the word communities, does that also include populations like, for instance, the elderly or people with respiratory conditions or things like that?
I think it could. I think that's a question that we have to figure out. If they're more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and this is a municipal impact assessment.
What I was going to add is this is the the program that Anne was speaking of that we've actually been working on, where we've already created an index that takes into consideration the reliability energy-wise of communities. It takes into consideration the availability of broadband and communication assets for the communities. It also takes information from recommended scenarios on economics from the CDC. And we have actually, with the help of Anne and the DPS, have already built that. That is what I sent to you, Catherine, a couple weeks ago. So I think we may have a pretty good start on that. I'm not saying we shouldn't look at going outside and starting over, but I think Anne would agree that we have a pretty good start on actually creating an index like that we're going to be using soon anyway.
This is Ben. I agree and would add two other building blocks that are part of where we start from. One is the VERI, Vermont Economic Resiliency, which really ranked the vulnerable communities and picked the 5 to work on based on an indexing of flood vulnerability in Vermont's communities. The other is ERAF, the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, which is really designed to reward communities that take steps to build their resiliency. And it's right there on the Flood Ready website. And one of the tasks in the State Hazard Mitigation Plan is, and there was a working group that sort of got sidetracked by COVID, but the working group is supposed to design the newer, smarter version of ERAF that will be more sensitive and accurate in measuring true community resilience. So the work was started.
One of the things I think, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. It looked like Kate had a comment.
Sure, thank you. I want to highlight something that Dave Snedeker said in the chat because he read my mind. Thank you, Dave. You said communities and populations, ? I sort of hear us talking about geographic areas that have vulnerabilities because of their geography, as well as groups of people that have vulnerabilities because of their characteristics or because of how they are impacted by systems. And so one such group would be older folks or people who are medically vulnerable. But as we are thinking about race and impacts of climate change, we also may want to look at the resilience of folks in groups that have traditionally been marginalized. And because we know that the impacts of climate change accrue to those groups in greater proportion. So that's, communities and populations could capture those types of things as we think about vulnerability.
Those are in the CDC recommendations on the one we've done. So
great.
That's one of the things I thought was promising about the GMP DPS model that you shared, is that it goes beyond just the built environment and the data of things that are on the ground, both the built and natural environment, and does incorporate that the person and the individual in the model, which I think is a great addition to some of these other ones, which may not have done that.
Thank you. So, I hadn't seen that, so that's great to know.
Is there a consensus among the committee that populations of people should be included in this vulnerability index and not just municipal boundaries?
Yes, but I think it's, well, I guess I didn't think about it that way.
Or is it that we consider populations of people within the municipal vulnerability index?
It's called the Municipal Vulnerability Index, right? So that kind of, to me, like the marginalized communities that are impacted sort of feed into the index.
Yes, and it, certain communities are going to score higher that have more need based on everything that's in the index. So I think naturally, if that's in there, it would just help us zero in on where we need to look at the most.
I think, like Ben said, there are all there's all these different indices that are out there, and some of them might be more developed than others, and some of them might be more focused on certain sectors than others. And it's like, how do you sort of synthesize all of those into this one overall index is what I think the challenge is here. Mm-hmm. And the last thing I just want to say is reading the, I'm like, okay, so after we crank out this municipal vulnerability index, what are we supposed to do with it? it's, I guess you could use it to track resilience overall or something, but there wasn't really any guidance about what's supposed to be done with that. And maybe that sort of helps us, since we don't have to do anything with it. We just have to develop it.
Yeah,
it kind of sets up the stage for that's something you do in the next update.
It does.
Yeah, and I would think the ones that raise to the top, what it does for us is it tells us which communities to go after first.
Yeah.
I mean, there's prioritization is one of them, or a gap analysis. I mean, there's all kinds of evaluate the strategies that we've come up with. I mean, but it doesn't really tell us. I mean, I guess doesn't mean we don't have to just stop there, but I'm just pointing out that if it's really a big lift, you may just at the end of this have the index, but haven't done anything with it. And maybe that's okay.
I put my hand up, but now I'm just going to jump in and say, as you're working through this one, I just want to, for Catherine's benefit and all of your benefits, remind you that you do have access to a facilitator. And I just want to point out that the facilitator is like Pat Field, who's also facilitating ag and ecosystems to get that cross-pollination there. He, we don't have enough hours for them to be at every meeting, but these sort of foundational meetings where you're getting yourself set up, he might be really helpful, and he's been helpful for ag and ecosystems. And because I think once you're kind of going through this objectives, what you're going to want to turn this into is a timeline for and thinking further out, like for meetings on who's going to be in charge of objective 3 and who's going to prepare and organize one of your meetings to focus on that. And when does that have to come with respect to timing of other things? And Pat might be really helpful, and maybe Catherine, you and I and Erica could meet with him in the next, ahead of next week's meeting and think about how to set this up to sort of get through this to then transition to sort of the timeline of actually moving into the work of this kind of stuff.
That would be great. And with that, given the time, I'm going to ask if there's any further comments on objective 3 for the time being. And if not, then I'm going to close this. Oh, now I can see everybody again. This is great. And now if it's okay with everybody, I think we'll move on to the public comment portion of the meeting. Okay, great. So are there any members of the public or non-subcommittee members who would like to provide comment? I don't see anybody wanting to provide any comment. Am I missing anybody? Mike, is your hand up still from an earlier comment?
If it is, it's from earlier. Sorry.
Okay. All right, great. Okay, well, if there's no public comment, I'm not seeing any. Is there any other comments that committee members would like to make before we adjourn and be ready for our meeting next week?
Catherine, it's Ben. I'll use the space to just make one follow-up comment. I think Joe asked a really important question that's been kicking around for me through a lot of the reading I've done for this committee, which is once we develop particularly the municipal vulnerability index, what are we going to do with it? What's the outcome? And I just wanted to flag for all of you an opportunity, which is the annual FEMA BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. And what the State Hazard Mitigation Plan is supposed to do is identify the state's priorities for where we apply federal mitigation dollars. And if it comes into focus for us that we have particular needs in particular communities, that is a building block for going after big federal dollars. And of course, the federal methodology right now is very cumbersome, and it hinges on the benefit cost analysis and being able to essentially prove to the federal government that the benefit cost ratio is positive for that investment of federal dollars. But this is an opportunity for us to not only identify our needs, but to prop up specific communities and specific projects in specific communities as state priorities and get federal dollars attached to that going forward. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Great. Thanks. And I think that's a good thing for us to think about. If we make sure we understand how we might want to use this tool, that will actually help inform how we build it and what's in it, or how we ask the consultant to build it for us and what's in it. Great. Well,
Anna's
thank you.
smiling because she knows how difficult it is to actually do what I just said.
You're totally right, Ben. And I'm thinking about, you know, where do we make this possible for a tiny town? And I think it has to be more help at the regional planning levels, more resources to help especially our smaller, shall I say, weaker towns, more volunteer-run towns.
Mm-hmm. That's better than weaker. That's right.
that are overwhelmed with vaccine deniers and climate change deniers. So.
Yes, I do see your comment now about reaching those people as well. Great. So we will plan to meet again on Friday the 9th at 1 p.m. and hopefully get some background work done in advance to help aid our conversation moving forward. Unfortunately, I was out sick for a week, so wasn't able to work with Erica much in advance of this meeting. So we didn't get a chance to do some advance work like we might have liked, but we will before our meeting on the 9th. And so hopefully we'll be able to move through this a little more quickly. But this conversation has been super helpful for me, and I think will really set the stage for us getting to work very quickly and actually getting some of this work done. So thank you, everybody. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. And I hope we didn't scare you away, Kate.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey,
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Catherine.